Well, good evening, everybody. We start tonight with the marital crisis in the Furnival household, with Mrs. Furnival flouncing out of her home, saying, "I will not consent to live with you while such deeds as these are being done." Now, we know that her suspicions are groundless, though we also know that Furnival does have more than a soft spot for the elegant and beautiful Lady Mason. I fancy that Trollope himself was half in love with his creation. He certainly paints her as a woman of exceptional beauty, charm, and grace. It's noteworthy that in English legal practice, clients wouldn't normally visit a barrister in chambers, except I think sometimes immediately prior to a trial. In this case, it's quite defensible, since the two have long been on friendly terms, knowing each other in the country and so forth. Trollope's comment is, "Man has power of purse and power of law, and if he goes to the wall, he must be a poor creature." Those who say so have probably never tried the position. I like that. While poor Furnival is contemplating his terrible predicament over a miserable, lonely breakfast, a letter is delivered, which is indeed from Lady Mason. And in this, she explains how she's come to be engaged to the aged baronet, but also how vigorously young Peregrine, the heir, has objected to such a union. She asks to call yet again at his chambers for advice on this dilemma. Furnival is very careful to pocket the envelope as well as the letter, lest his jealous wife spots that both come from the supposedly Scarlet Woman. Now, we may as well follow Mrs. Furnival in her vendetta against Lady Mason, although that actually appears a chapter or two later. Mrs. Furnival, understandably, gets fed up with the nosy and manipulative Martha Biggs, her one confidant, and alludes her to go down to Hamworth to beard her supposedly sinful ladyship. On finding that the sinner is not at home, but staying at the Cleve, she even braves that august pile. Fortunately, the devoted Mrs. Orme rapidly twigs where the misconception lies, persuades the aggrieved wife that Lady Mason is seriously unwell, B has been engaged to marry no less a paragon than Sir Peregrine, and C is in terrible legal trouble and had very good reason to call on Mr. Furnival. We are relieved when Furnival manages to entice his wife back in a later chapter by a rather austere but quite subtle letter. It's the offer of £50, with more to come, that really seems to tip the scale. When I first encountered this novel, I initially thought that I couldn't much care for Sir Peregrine Orme. He came across at first as so absorbed in his ancient lineage, his ancestral estate dating back centuries, that I thought him an unattractive, conceited prig. It's the mark of Trollope's genius that we gradually grow to admire him. We begin to see him not only as a figure of true nobility and great generosity, but even as an empathetic human being. He suffered two terrible tragedies in the loss of his beloved son and heir, and also of his wife. We're told nothing of the circumstances of either bereavement, but we can feel his loneliness. It finally becomes quite believable that such a man might contemplate marriage to the very much younger Lady Mason. She too has handled to her name due to her late husband's knighthood, but we're in no doubt that she is in no way Sir Peregrine's social equal. Her origins are middle class at best. An ancient baronetcy, a landed estate, true chivalric armorial bearings once born into battle, doubtless with many quarterings, all put him far above her in public perception. Yet we find it entirely plausible that such a lonely old man might turn to such a lady, and even more strangely that she might contemplate sharing board and bed with this antique baronet. Her first husband, old Sir Joseph Mason, had been 45 years her senior. Sir Peregrine cannot have been so much the elder. Back in chapter 1, we were told that Sir Peregrine's ancestor had once knelt at the feet of an improper princess, and also that Sir Peregrine was by no means displeased at any allusion to this remote and scandalous liaison. The old British title of baronet is an interesting feature of the Victorian social scene. It only ever occurred in Britain. It never existed. There was no comparable title on the continent. It did exist in Nova Scotia, as our Canadian members will be well aware, I'm sure. And in Trollope's day, it was not, in fact, all that old. It was conceived by James VI and First as a cynical expedient to raise funds for his catastrophic Ulster plantation, without destabilizing either the House of Lords or Parliament as a whole. After the 250 years, it had acquired a certain patina and was, I fancy, often viewed as more venerable than baronies. Baronies did confer a seat in the House of Lords, as baronetcies did not, but they were at this time far too widely conferred on new wealth. One proliferating section was widely despised as, quote, the beerage. Although Roger Scatchard was granted a baronetcy, by Trollope, of course, to the great misery of his poor wife, I fancy that such grants to, I mean, he was a building railway contractor, were far less common. Many of these hereditary honours were conferred on ancient landed gentry families who didn't quite cut it to join the titled nobility, often because an earlier hereditary title had become extinct due to lack of a male heir. The family, the estates, and the social position could all continue through a niece or a cousin. Baronets were thus widely perceived as figures deserving respect, maybe awe and veneration. Here in Devon, our ancient baronets are much respected. I don't want to dwell too long on some of the subplots. The next one we encounter is Kenneby and his convoluted love life. The best of this for me is Miriam's lament for her departed mahoganies, now supplanted by Mulder's horrible steel furniture. I had as nice a set of mahoganies as ever a woman could want, and bought with my own money too, John, but he took them away. Trollope can slip seamlessly into vernacular and let us know by the idiom just what sort of person is speaking. The embittered Dockwrath, and that's one of Trollope's best semi-silly names, incidentally, is slowly assembling his witnesses for the prosecution, and he enlists both Kenneby and Cantwise. There's a rather poignant meeting between Kenneby and the Miriam he has never quite stopped loving through many years since they last met. Mrs. Dockwrath, as Miriam has now become, is anxious to prevent her old lover supporting her husband's vendetta against Lady Mason. You won't say anything against her, will you? You won't go over to his side, eh, John? Dockwrath, however, is implacable, as the simple Kenneby is forced to sign a formal deposition of all he knows about the Orley Farm case. Then in chapter 43, we get into another love dilemma with the widow Smiley and her £200 a year. Mrs. Smiley, we're told, is a fine set widow of around 40 with a steady income of £200 from the brickyard. It's really one of the most extraordinary wooings in all fiction. At first, the honest John Kennedy is at great pains to tell his intended that he still has feelings for Miriam Dockwrath, who has managed to produce 14 or maybe 16 infants. Trollope does contradict himself on the exact number, but then infant mortality was terrible in those days. She's produced all those since his dalliance with her. It is Mrs. Mulder who is really driving this difficult interview, and she is present throughout. Eventually, the couple reach a mysterious understanding with no hint of a proposal or mention of matrimony. Mr. Mulder is a figure to conjure with, falling asleep after his 3 whiskies. It's quite a relief to find next morning that after a mere couple of sodas and brandies, he is as sweet as sweet. In both these chapters, Trollope's unique experience of travel all over England on his post office business and mixing with every possible class and condition of folk plays rich dividends. Now, we as readers may have had doubts about Mary Mason's innocence through all the earlier parts of the novel, but we were never quite sure. Chapter 41 shows clearly that Furnival, although he's strongly drawn to the lady, reluctantly suspects her of forgery. In chapter 45, Lady Mason goes to tell Sir Peregrine that she cannot marry him. She enters his library with no intention whatever of saying anything more than that. It is his nobility and generosity and desperate impatience to press on with the marriage that finally overcomes her and leads her to reveal the full truth and her shame, quite literally on her knees. I think this is one of Trollope's finest passages, and it is this that I see as the fulcrum of this whole wonderful novel. Trollope himself was later to regret in his autobiography that he had blown the gaff too early in the story. I don't agree. I find the way that the baronet's daughter-in-law, Edith, manages to forgive Mary and continue her close and loving friendship despite her feeling of utter horror at the crime itself, deeply moving. And she then persuades her father-in-law to continue his protection of the sinner. Edith, we are told, was cunning in letting the servants know that the marriage is not to happen, while making very clear that Lady Mason is still an honoured guest, deserving of every comfort. After this shattering event, we are told that Mary has all feminine graces forgotten, which had stood her in truth so royally. The baronet retires to his library in great anguish of mind. How was he to help her? How was he to be rid of her? Clearly a chap who is seriously conflicted. There's one extraordinary aspect of this particular book. Anthony Trollope and the Jersey-born artist Edward Everett Millais were by now close friends, and Millais had already illustrated books for Trollope, for which he was immensely grateful, saying that no work had ever been better illustrated. But for this book, he actually dragged Millais off to see the scene of his own childhood misery at Julian's End, just outside Harrow on the Hill. That was where the young Trollope had smuggled a few treasures out of the back door and through the hedge to save them from the bailiffs who were stripping the house. The Society's splendid edition carries all the Millais etchings, and they vividly bring to life both Julian's End, also Orley Farm, as well as those poignant moments between Sir Peregrine and his fiancée, as she had been, and between the anguished Mary and the faithful, though deeply troubled, Edith Orme. We know from the autobiography that Trollope's harrow years had been ones of deep misery, loneliness, and humiliation. I find it quite puzzling that he wanted Orley Farm to look exactly like Julian's End. Was it that he'd already determined that Lady Mason and her son were to lose the property? Was it jinxed? Was it that Joseph Mason, who was to acquire it, was a thoroughly nasty bit of work? Or what? I simply can't decide. It's worth saying that Joseph is a thoroughly nasty bit of work, as is his miserly wife. But that was very unusual for Trollope. He's usually punctilious, not to say comforting, in his insistence that most of us possess some redeeming feature at least. Millais himself was to receive a baronetcy in later life. He's famous here in Devon for his wonderfully evocative oil known as The Boyhood of Raleigh. It's a portrait of the young Walter Raleigh, who was born just outside our little town, sitting with his friend Gilbert on the seashore, while they listened to an old sea dog sitting on our seawall and declaiming tall nautical tales. Our little museum here managed to borrow the original back for a display in our beautiful little thatch museum a few years ago to celebrate the 150th anniversary of that painting. I digress. In chapter 47, we return to Noningsby to see the wounded Felix Graham confined to his bed and eating pheasant. Felix has a growing attachment to the daughter of the house, Madeline. He's also being inveigled by Judge Staveley into joining Mary Mason's defence team. The connection to the main story is, yet again, rather tenuous. This is something that avid subscribers to Victorian circulating libraries seem to have found acceptable. It must have kept them seething with eager suspense. Was it Trollope himself who once wrote that no young lady would dare enter a drawing room without knowing the latest state of play in the current epic installment novel? Many of us now can find it a bit of a distraction. Frankly, for those of us of advancing years, the immense cast of characters and the complexity of amorous, legal, property, and other relationships can be something of a trial by recall. Now, the interest of this chapter lies in the fact that Lady Staveley, the mum, regards Felix as an utterly unsuitable suitor for her daughter, whereas she feels that young Peregrine Orme would be just the thing. Lady Staveley knows nothing of young Perry's sordid obsession with rats. Trollope likes to remind us from time to time that young Perry had released a whole bagful of rodents in his college hall at Oxford and been rusticated for his pains. Lady Staveley has quite other concerns. Felix has no capital, negligible earnings, no distinguished family links, and he is, to her eye, very ugly. What a trouble daughters can be. I've got 3 of them. The judge, on the other hand, has spotted a seriously penetrating legal intelligence and bright prospects in the young barrister. He asserts that Felix looks very well in his wig. Later, the judge will suggest that Felix should not renew his offer to marry Madeline so soon after her first rejection, but he can come to stay again in 3 months' time, when the judge hopes an offer might be better received. He makes it clear that he would regard the young man as a most acceptable son-in-law. In our final chapter, 53, Lady Mason at last returns home to Orley Farm. Messrs. Round and Aram first arranged the formal indictment with Lucius, her son, now hugely relieved the marriage is off, and seemingly still convinced of his mother's innocence. Lucius and Sir Peregrine as her bondsman. There is a rather uncomfortable passage about Solomon Aram's Jewishness. We're told that he's not such a man as they might have expected. This is deeply uncomfortable to our ears. We can only wish it had never been written. Alas, it was not so unusual at that time. I'd like to finish, if I may, with a couple of general comments about this novel and its place in the Irv. I did miss a couple of these talks, so please forgive me if I duplicate anything already said. I hope you'll feel that one or two of these thoughts do bear repetition. If we look at Trollope's whole career, this really was a key period. Trollope and Rose had moved to Waltham House in 1860, and that was hugely important to Anthony. It gave him the opportunity, really for the first time, to live as he conceived that a gentleman should live, to entertain on a modest scale, to indulge his taste for fine wines, to continue his hunting while carrying out his ever-increasing responsibilities at the post office. Trollope was elected to the Garrick Club in 1861, and that meant a great deal to him. He didn't generally stay there for dinner, as many clubmen did. He normally wanted to get home to Rose and his own fireside. Still, he did love to pop in there after he left St. Martin's le Grand for a rubber or two of whist with his friends. And at last he did have close friends, close literary friends. True enough, he'd made good friends in Ireland, and to his everlasting credit, he made them on both sides of the great ethnic and religious divide, which was a near impenetrable barrier to so many in those years. But these Garrick friends were a different matter, and altogether more important to his personal growth and to his literary journey. He became intimate with Thackeray and George Eliot and George Lewis, being quite untroubled by their irregular union, with Sir John Millais and many other leading figures in the artistic world. It is thanks to A.A. Milne's generous bequest of, I think it's the proportion of the royalties of Winnie the Pooh, that the Garrick are still able to preserve their fine collection of Trollopiana in such fine condition and splendid settings. Family Parsonage was published to great acclaim, both critical and commercial, in 1862. Orley Farm itself was also published in 1862. So you can see that it comes in the early period of his real success as a published author, but also in the early years of his mature manhood, when at last he felt free of the horrors of his childhood and youth, when his family fell inexorably from an impoverished gentility to dishonor, bailiffs, and bankruptcy. Family Parsonage had been a tremendous success. It was initially published in the Cornhill in 16 installments in 1860, then a 3-volume novel that same year. For both, Trollope was paid £1,000. For Orley Farm, he was paid £3,135, more than a triple increase. Both were initially published serially. And this was a new modus operandi for Trollope, which has pluses and minuses for his modern readers. Many will think it made it too long and disparate. There are an awful lot of subplots, some linked rather tenuously to the action. And yet, we gain from some wonderful set pieces, some of which I find as funny as anything he ever wrote. We gain from the author's own first-hand experience of northern towns and commercial rooms, of cheap lodging houses, and the fashion for revolting steel furniture. All this meant that he was now an established literary figure with a secure income and a sure position in society. The political novels had come later, from 1864 on, although Plantagenet Palliser does appear briefly in The Small House at Allington, making an improbable, unrequited advances to the singularly unappealing Griselda, Lady Dumbello. Very truly a dumb bell. There is one other factor that I suggest was enormously important to Trollope at this period and influenced the writing of Orley. He first met Kate Field in 1860 in Florence, where his older brother Tom somehow contrived to maintain an elegant salon at Vigino Trollope, where some of the most intelligent and gifted people of that age would gather. Anthony introduced the young Kate to many of the leading literary figures in Europe at the Villina. She would never forget that. Anthony grew to be extremely fond of her and remained close to her for the rest of his life. They fell into a pattern of renewing the friendship whenever they happened to be on the same continent, but allowing it to simmer down when separated by the Atlantic or the Pacific. Some foolish, excitable people have jumped to the conclusion that they were lovers, or at the very least, Anthony wished that they were. I'm convinced that is a total misreading of his letters. Sadly, hers have not survived the great literary chasm. He does indeed write with great and overt affection. There is much there of agape, but never a hint of eros. Henry Trollope was his father's literary executor, and Rose survived him by many years. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for either or both to have done a Cassandra Austen and pruned or purged those letters as Cassie had done for Jane, to our everlasting regret. Neither chose to do so. Rose was in fact fond of Kate herself and often invited her to stay in their home. I think Rose realized that such a friendship was fruitful grist to Anthony's literary mill. Now, Tom Trollope lived most of his adult life in Italy, first at Florence and then with his second wife at Rome. He lived quite a lot longer than Anthony and did return to England for his later years. It's of little interest to any of you, but considerable interest to me, that he settled here in Budleigh Salterton, where I'm speaking, between 1886 and 1892. And the blue plaque commemorating the residence of Thomas Adolphus Trollope in our little town is just 3 doors up from our own first home when we arrived here in the 1980s. Fortunately, we know a good deal more about Kate. She was an American girl, and Trollope was generally fond of American girls, as he found them far more fun than demure, prissy Victorian English girls. Kate was extremely intelligent and brimful of energy, charm, and ambition. She needed all of those, for she was virtually penniless. Yet she contrived to appear in society in very elegant costumes and was widely regarded as an accomplished and very clever young woman. She managed to publish a great deal, mostly journalism or travel writing, and became a very successful lecturer. Some folk described her as beautiful. I fancy she was not so much beautiful as vivacious and very eloquent. Trollope describes her as one of his brown girls. He always had a soft spot for this enigmatic group of women. He seems to have meant not that they were at all dark in pigment. Kate was certainly no such thing. On the other hand, he didn't like them to be too white or waxen, which he associated with overbreeding and a hothouse sort of existence. His brown girls had a healthy skin that had known sun and rain, preferably riding to hounds, combined with naturally brunette and not over-contrived hair. Janice, I can't pronounce her name, Drobach, showed us in the last Tropiana that women of this period were not allowed to show an inch of their persons in their day costumes. Evening costume, of course, was another matter, as necklines could be quite low, though carefully monitored and policed by the Mrs. Proudies and dowager moral opinion at large. Therefore, ladies went to enormous trouble and expense to make the most of their hair as the one bit of their person normally on public view. Trollope would have none of that. He liked natural hair. Incidentally, skirts were not yet the preposterous crinolines which I told somebody to wear for dinner of the next decade, but they were very full, as we can see in the Millet etchings. That was achieved by stiff crin petticoats. It's a anglicisation of quiet in French, made of thick horsehair. That crin must have been very heavy and extremely hot. So perhaps crinolines on their light whalebone frames came almost as a relief to that sorely tried generation of fashionable ladies. Kate and Mary, Lady Mason, have little, if anything, in common. Nonetheless, my own hunch is that Trollope would never have depicted the titled Englishwoman quite as alluringly as he did, had he not grown so close to the impoverished, untitled, but brown and supremely gifted Southern belle. And that would be our grievous loss. Thank you very much.